Good afternoon, everyone. I think we are ready to start this webinar on the proposed revised revision of the transparency rules of the Clinical Trials Information System. My name is Juan García Burgos. I'm Head of Public and Stakeholder Engagement at the European Medicines Agency, and I'm also co-chair of the Healthcare Professionals Working Party and the Patients and Consumers Working Party. And are these two working parties, these groups, who have organized this webinar in order to inform of the proposed revision of these rules. But in view of the interest that these rules have generated, we have extended the invitation to all EMA-eligible organizations representing patients and healthcare professionals, but also to selected non-commercial European clinical trial data and translational research organizations and networks, such as academia, and also to members of the public who expressed interest in and who have been in contact with EMA regarding this topic. It includes as well members of the European Parliament who have taken the opportunity and have joined the webinar. So before we start, just some housekeeping notes in order how we will be running this webinar. Panelists and speakers, many, if not most, the majority of them will be physically here at the European Medicines Agency, but we also have colleagues online. But the attendees in its majority are online. And we encourage you as much as possible to raise your hand and to make your intervention orally when we come to the questions and answer session. And you may, if so you wish, to use the chat in WebEx, but I think as much as possible, based on experience, it works much better if you speak, and we encourage to turn on your camera, and then we can have a more dynamic discussion. The meeting is going to be recorded, and the idea is to try to do it for minute purposes and to ensure we have a proper record, but also we may consider publication of the webinar. And today's webinar, the objectives, this was described in the agenda, which has been circulated to you. And as you know, we would like to provide information about the results of the public consultation on the transparency rules for the Clinical Trials Information System, for CTIS. These results, the outcome of this consultation, has been used and has been the basis for the revision of the rules, which are going to be proposed. They are going to be presented soon to the management board, and which will be the basis for defining the level of transparency that we will be applying to clinical trials in the EU. As you know, the Clinical Trials Information System was launched in 2022, and the transparency rules which apply to them currently are in line with what we call the CTIS disclosure rules, which were adopted 8 years ago. So we are aware that 8 years nowadays is a lot of time, and there was a need to consider and to review them. And this was also confirmed by feedback that we have received from stakeholders and by users of the system, and including an open letter where academic and independent researchers were calling for EMA to take action and to the management board to take action and review these rules. So we wanted to do that, but in order to do that, we wanted first to launch a public consultation and see exactly what the different stakeholders group needed, which were their needs, their requests, and based on this, propose a revision. So the consultation was launched in May and concluded in June this year, and we gathered feedback from over 200 stakeholders. So today we will present the outcome of this consultation, and we will see how we have used. The intention, the idea is to have rules which are refined, which are more streamlined, and that they meet the requirements of the legislation, but that the process is more simple, the process is more efficient and is user-friendly, and at the same time maintains public access to key information on clinical trials. So we aim at provide timely transparency that benefits and that helps all stakeholders, and which is in line with the requirements of the legislation. So we hope that this webinar will bring clarity about how the process for the revision of the rules has been done and how we are proposing to change these rules. So I look forward to the discussion, and before formally opening the webinar, I will give the floor to Björn Eriksson, who will formally open it. Björn, as you may know, is the Director General of the Swedish Medical Products Agency, MPA. He's a member of the Heads of Medicines Agency Management Group, and he's also the mentor of the Clinical Trials Coordination Group, CTCG. And you will agree that no one is better placed to open formally this webinar. So thank you, Björn, for being with us today.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you for this webinar, which is very welcomed. Discussing and developing the transparency rules for the clinical trials information system is core, and it's very important in many aspects. From the beginning, we know that excellent clinical trials, they are the core of excellent clinical evidence and clinical research. Excellent evidence is critical to develop new medicines and for us to do the benefit risk assessments, authorizing medicines, and to improve how medicines are used in the market. So clinical trials is at the forefront of our focus. So the European Regulatory Network is committed to improve clinical trials in Europe, and this is done through a lot of actions and initiatives. The most important is the new clinical trials regulation. And the basic tool for the clinical trials regulation and the fundament of this is the platform, the Clinical Trials Information System, CTIS. And it has, as you said, Juan, been developed for many years and years of hypercare and transition periods. And we will discuss transparency rules for this at this webinar. I need to remember also to mention that the accelerating clinical trials in the EU initiative is very important to just enhance the importance of excellent clinical trials and to support the clinical trials information system. It aims to facilitate collaboration between all stakeholders in Europe and leading to better, more impactful clinical trials and for even more inclusions of patients and more benefit for patients. So this is also important to mention. The network working with regulatory issues in the pharmaceutical area wants to improve access for patients, healthcare professionals, researchers, and all other key stakeholders. And this is by ensuring transparency of clinical data. And then in this setting, clinical trial data. This webinar is an opportunity to take a deep dive on transparency in the clinical trials regulation and its implementation in the clinical trials information system, CTIS. And you should remember that we still are in a transition period of the regulation, and it takes time to set everything in perfect order and in perfect shape. And this could be said about the CTIS because we are dealing with a lot of things to improve the system to be more user-friendly. So I'm really grateful for everyone that you participate in this consultation, for the consultation, for the public consultation, and for you listening to the results of this. And the feedback will be discussed today, and this is also fully in line with the intentions of the clinical trials regulation. So I really look forward for the discussion, and later on I come back to the panel, but I wish you all a successful meeting, and over to you, Juan.
Thank you very much, Björn, for the very nice introduction, acknowledging the work done and the contribution from the stakeholders. And I think we can go now to the agenda and to the presentation, the first presentation. And I think we have structured the webinar in two presentations. The first one will be setting the scene and presenting the results of the public consultation and the feedback from all the user community. And then we will break for a Q&A, but just a Q&A in case there are requests for clarifications of this first presentation, and then we will follow up with another presentation on the proposed rules. So I give the floor to Giacomo Capone, who will present the outcome of the consultation. And Giacomo is scientific specialist and qualified good clinical practice inspector on secondment and the agency at the moment, but he has been working at the Italian authority. So thank you, Giacomo, for presenting the outcome of the consultation.
Thank you, Juan, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start setting the scene for transparency in the clinical trial information system. Let's see the slide. Okay, thank you. Doesn't work. Okay. I will start with the requirements for transparency that are established by the clinical trials regulation, and then on the current transparency rules in the clinical trial information systems, with a focus on the mechanisms in place to protect personal data and commercially confidential information. And later, I will show the results of the public consultation that was launched in May 2023 on the transparency rules for the operation of the clinical trial regulation and the clinical trial information system. Okay. Clinical trials are part of the clinical research and are at the heart of the medical advances and medical progress. Clinical trials are studies intended to discover or verify the effects of one or more investigational medicinal products. They are also critical to generate the clinical evidence and key for the decision-making process. The clinical trials regulations aims to ensure that the rights, safety, and well-being of the trial participants are protected, but also that data generated in clinical trials are reliable and robust. Transparency is key for all the stakeholders involved in clinical trials. Some of these benefits can be easily evident and easy to see for all the stakeholders. I've listed here in the left part of the slide some of the easy to spot benefits for the stakeholders. Of course, for example, enrollment can be clearly beneficial for all patients that can decide to start and to be enrolled into a clinical trial. But also it is beneficial for sponsors who can have a faster recruitment rate in the clinical trial. And of course, it's beneficial for clinical trials investigators and for the community, of course, and it's going to be beneficial for innovation and research in general. Other benefits that are evident is, for example, the transparency on the outcome of the clinical trial can be beneficial for patients again, who can understand and know what happened to the clinical trial they took part in, and also for healthcare professionals to increase their knowledge, and for other sponsors who want to run similar clinical trials in order to avoid, for example, duplicates and have an impact on innovation and research. It also, transparency on clinical trials can also have a benefit because the civil society can have an idea of what scientific evidence is submitted to the authorities in order to have a marketing authorization application. And also this is beneficial for other sponsors, of course, and clinical trial investigators. Transparency is also a way to build trust among stakeholders. And transparency doesn't come without any challenge. In fact, it has to be balanced with the confidentiality, because we have all the right to transparency and to the disclosure of information, but also we have the right to keep some of this information confidential, especially when it comes to protection of personal data and other confidential information. Transparency is also a pillar of the clinical trials regulation. And one way we deliver transparency is through the public website of the Clinical Trial Information System, CTIS. I reported here the Article 81 of the regulations, which talks about the need for transparency in the public database, where also there are listed exceptions justified on specific grounds. For example, some information could be protected, such as personal data, commercially confidential information, but also confidential communications between member states and the supervision of the conduct of clinical trials by member states. Transparency is at present handled and managed thanks to the appendix on disclosure rules that was published in 2015, and it was endorsed by the EMA Management Board in 2015. Next slide. And how transparency is currently managed in the system. First of all, we have a broad publication of the documents that are part of the clinical trial application dossier, and also of the information submitted through the CTIS during the clinical trial life cycle. And we also have mechanisms in place to protect personal data and CCI. The two mechanisms in place are the deferral and the redaction functionalities. The deferral mechanisms can delay the publication of certain specific documents up to 7 years after the end of the clinical trial. And this is applicable in consideration of specific categories of clinical trials that we will see later. We also have redaction mechanisms in place to protect commercially confidential information, specifically for the documents that are intended for publication. Of course, of note is that the reduction of personal data is always applicable, and regardless of the use of the deferrals. Here in this slide, we see that the appendix on disclosure rules gives an overview of the timing of the publication of data and documents in relation to the conduct of a clinical trials, and according to the classification of the clinical trial as category 1, 2, or 3. For category 1, we consider the trials that are part of the early pharmaceutical development, such as phase 0, 1 bioequivalence studies and bioavailability studies. For these category trials, the maximum time of deferral is of 7 years after the end of the clinical trials in the European Union EAA. For category 2, clinical trials that are mainly phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, the maximum time of deferral is 5 years after the end of the clinical trial. And for category 3, which means mainly phase 4 clinical trials, the maximum time of deferral is up to the publication of the summary of results. There are, of course, some exceptions for pediatric clinical trials. Let's move on to the next slide. The reduction mechanism is the alternative option that we can use to protect CCI in the version for publication. The application of this mechanism of reduction to protect CCI should be limited to the information that meets the definition of CCI, which means commercially confidential information. The CCI is an information, of course, that is not publicly available, and it is an information whose publication and disclosure could undermine the legitimate economic interest and competitive competitive position of a sponsor of a concerned entity. As you can see here as an example, we put an image where we can see that the level of reduction to protect CCI should decrease over time as the development plan advances. And as you can see, in fact, at the beginning, there are more information that can be redacted in the document published in the public portal. And over time, with substantial modification coming in the clinical trial, more information should be, less information should be considered commercially confidential. Next slide. What are then the drivers for change? First of all, we have a decreased number of clinical trials in the EU. And also, we ran, a survey was run in last year, last summer, and this survey was targeted for sponsors who had worked in the CTIS, submitting clinical trials. The feedback we received from these sponsors was that transparency requirements are perceived as an obstacle for the clinical trial regulation implementation. Also, we acknowledge that the transparency requirements are complex, and this complexity of the current rules might lead to technical and human error. Moreover, there are concerns about the timing for the publication of some of the key documents and information related to the clinical trial, namely the protocol, because the deferral mechanisms can allow a delay of publication up to 7 years from the end of the trial. For this reason, we launched a new public consultation specifically on the transparency rules in the clinical trial information system. This consultation was launched in May and lasted until the 28th of June, and we intended to gather the feedback from the stakeholders community. Next slide. Here, I showed the content of the public consultation. It was there are 4 main fields in this public consultation. First of all, the affiliation from a predefined list of options, and then we have 3 questions. The first one is related to the publication of structured data and documents that are considered critically important to be published in the public portal, in the public domain. Then we have a specific question on the deferral functionalities in CTIS and the reduction mechanism to protect CCI in particular, because obviously it protects, it is always used to protect personal data. Next slide. Let's see the result of the survey and the public consultation. We received 204 valid responses to the public consultation. As you can see here, we have the responses grouped by the affiliation, and it's easy to see that the major respondents to the survey are the commercial sponsors, including SMEs, and the contract research organizations. But it's of note that all the stakeholders took the time to respond to the survey. Next slide. The first question was related to the structured data and what structured data are critically important for publication for the stakeholders. Instead of going through all the structured data that we asked, that we put in the survey, I just wanted to highlight here in this table the ones that were selected by the majority of the stakeholders. And as you can see, this in green, we have the ones that are important for the more important for publication for the stakeholders. For example, the clinical trial design information, the details of the medicinal products used in the clinical trial, and the details of the trial sponsors. And when it comes to the notifications, the fields that are important for the stakeholders are the trial status, the recruitment status, and the temporary halt of the clinical trial. I've also highlighted in red some of the structured data that are not considered important for publication, and of note that we see the request for information raised by the competent authorities that are called RFI, and the RFI responses from the sponsors, and also the assessments carried out by regulatory authorities on the notifications. Slide. We also, back, okay. We also asked which documents are important for publication in the public domain. And again, we have a table with a list of documents, and I highlighted in green the one that were considered by the majority as important for publication. And we see here, so the protocol, the recruitment arrangements, the subject information and the informed consent, and also summary of results and the clinical study reports. We then asked the stakeholders if there are compelling reasons to keep the deferral mechanisms to protect CCI. As you can see here from the graph, there are divergent opinions and views according to the stakeholders. For example, patients consider that there are no compelling reasons to keep the deferral mechanisms, while commercial sponsors and contract research organizations are more keen to keep the deferral mechanism to protect CCI. If the amount of the documents to be present in the public domain remains as such. Next slide. Okay. We also asked if the reduction mechanism can be enough to protect commercially confidential information in the documents intended for publication in the public domain. Again, we have divergent opinions and views, with patients considering reduction as a useful mean to protect CCI, and also healthcare professionals considering reduction sufficient to protect CCI, while commercial sponsors more keen to not considering CCI reduction mechanism enough to protect CCI, especially because the amount of documents published in the public domain is considered too burdensome for them to handle at the time of the clinical trial application dossier submission. Next slide. As we obtain divergent opinions and views, we also went to analyze every single message and comments that we received from the stakeholders in the open field for comments that were was open in the survey. I selected here only some of those comments, and the ones that are in favor of the deferral mechanisms to protect CCI, and also the ones that are less in favor of the deferral mechanisms. As you can see, there are some stakeholders considering deferrals as negative for patient safety, and also a limitation to transparency. But also other stakeholders consider deferrals necessary to protect CCI. Things that came out quite striking from the comments of the stakeholder is that it's not the amount of documents present in the public domain to be important. The thing that is more important to the stakeholder is the timing of such publication. That is also depending on the stage of the medicinal product development. There is also fear for some of the stakeholders that sponsor will tend to avoid the European Union as to run their clinical trials, especially for the early developmental phase of the clinical trial. In conclusion, we have seen what are the current rules applicable to manage transparency in the clinical trial information system, and we saw the results of the public consultation on the transparency rules. These results show that stakeholders, of course, have different views and needs, and we see that industry focuses more on the protection of the CCI, and the civil society is asking instead for more and immediate access to the key clinical trial documents. Overall, we received a consensus on the need for simplification of the transparency rules. Also, it's clear that deferrals are considered to be maintained only if the number of documents that are intended to be published remains so high, because it is otherwise the reduction is seen to be too burdensome for the sponsors to handle. And in conclusion, medical writing will in the future play an important role also to manage the content of the documents, because reducing the amount of personal data and commercially confidential information in an early stage of the production of the documents will help to limit the need for future reduction in the documentations. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions on the topic.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, for being so clear. And yeah, I open now the floor in case there are questions. Again, I would like to limit the questions now just to clarifications, because we will have an open session when the rules are presented. So any immediate reaction? Is there anything you would like Giacomo to expand or clarify? No, it all seems very clear. So then we can definitely move to the next presentation and present the proposed rules. And it's my pleasure to introduce Laura Pioppo, who will do the presentation. Laura is a senior scientific specialist at the European Medicines Agency, and she is the business expert for the clinical trials information system. And Laura will take us through the new rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon. So the presentation is on the revision of the transparency rules for the clinical trial information system. So let's start with a table of content for the presentation. The first point is to define the objective of the revision of CTIS transparency rules. We will then go more into the details for the proposal of the new transparency rules for the structured data fields in CTIS, and the proposal for the new transparency rules for the documents. And then we will cover the benefits for the different stakeholders group introduced by this revision, and we will conclude with a take-home message. So on the objective of the revision of CTIS transparency rules, the objective is to ensure that we have a timely transparency that delivers for stakeholders via different means. The first element to consider is the timing, ensuring an earlier publication of key clinical trial information. When I use the term clinical trial information, I refer to both the structured data fields in CTIS and the documents. The structured data are the fields populated by the users when working in the system. This can be free text or can be a list of predefined values to be selected, while the documents are uploaded in dedicated placeholder. And in this revision, we will cover the transparency rules for both elements. The second point to consider for a purposeful transparency is to ensure publication of information that is most relevant for the public, focusing on the needs of patients and focusing on the needs of clinical researchers in the European Union. The third element is the simplification of the system. As we have heard, at the moment in CTIS, we have complex transparency rules. We have the deferral mechanism described in the appendix on disclosure that was intended to be the mechanism to protect commercially confidential information. By removing the deferral functionalities in CTIS, we will ensure a simplified process for defining the publication aspect and ensure a timely publication of data and documents without the need to wait for a certain number of years. Overall, this revision aims to have a balanced approach between the transparency and the publication of information, while at the same time protecting commercially confidential information as foreseen in the regulation in Article 81.4. So the objective and the aim is to have a less complex, more efficient and user-friendly system, maintaining early public access to key clinical trial information, always in line with the requirements of the CTR. Now I will go a little bit more into the details. I will guide you through the proposal for changes for the publication of structured data, and then I will also describe the documents. So starting from structured data, the structured data represent a very valuable source of information for clinical trials. It's the section of the database where we have information on the trial design, endpoints of the trial, inclusion and exclusion criteria, product details, sponsor details, and the sites where the trial is running. So basically there are no changes, no substantial changes for the publication rules of structured data fields. These remain largely unchanged, with the relevant information on the trials be published at the time of the decision of the first member states concerned. At the same time, we have to recognize, of course, that not all the clinical trials are the same. So we need to remember and recognize the specificities for the publication of structured data fields for early development phase trials, meaning phase 0, first in human, bioequivalence and bioavailability, all the trials that fall under the so-called category 1 trials that Giacomo has described in his presentation. For these trials, we will continue to have some specific rules for publication that will continue to be in place with the objective to protect CCI. Something new introduced with this revision is about the information on the strength of the medicinal product and dose details, referring to daily dose, maximum dose allowed, and the duration of the treatment for certain type of trials. This will no longer be published, but this is just limited to the integrated phase 1 and phase 2 trials and category 1 trials conducted in pediatric population. Listening to the sponsors, we have heard that this is quite problematic, the current publication of these fields. These are considered CCI, so under the new rules, only for this type of trials, the information will not be in the public domain. However, the details will continue to be published for all the remaining trials that represent the vast majority. The last bullet point is about the RFI. The requests for information that are raised by the member states concerned during the assessment and the corresponding responses from the sponsors under the current implemented rules are published. These also represent a challenge for both the authorities and the sponsors because by nature may contain personal data and CCI, and under the new rules will no longer be available in the public domain. Now, regarding the documents, I mentioned under the objectives to focus on the publication of key documents that make the difference, that are of interest for the patients and for the general public. So these documents will be subject to publication, and by focusing the publication on these documents, we can also then remove the deferral functionalities from the system, which will bring substantial benefits under different aspects. First of all, removing the deferral functionalities, the publication of key documents will occur at the time of the decision on the clinical trial application and prior to the start of the trial. This will be the case for the vast majority of the trial for phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 trials, falling in category 2 and 3, for which the publication of these key documents will be earlier in time. The publication of the protocol, therefore, will always be prior or at the latest together with a summary of results. Of course, again, will depend on the trial category. And removing the deferral mechanism, the reduction will then be the method to be used to protect CCI and, of course, personal data if they are included in the document to be published. We also mentioned that medical writing plays a very important role because, of course, adjusting the content of the document, we can reduce the amount of reduction that is needed. Regarding the summary of results, these are published when submitted during the trial life cycle, with exception, of course, of category 1 in adults, for which the publication will occur a little bit later in time, meaning 30 months after the end of the trial in the European Union. Let's see now more details in this slide, particularly for the documents. Once again, vast majority of the clinical trials in the EU, category 2 and category 3, meaning phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 trials. The publication of the documents will be at the time of the decision, and this will be any decision, positive or negative, and applicable for the protocol, including the synopsis and the patient-facing documents, if they're provided, the informed consent, the SMPC, of course, if the product has already a marketing authorization, and the recruitment arrangement, including advertising material. For the same trial categories, the publication of the results will occur when the results are submitted. And according to the law, now we have a clear legal requirements for the sponsors stipulated in the regulation to submit the results, and together with a layperson summary, the submission should be done in the system within 12 months from the end of the trial in the European Union. When the results are submitted, the results will be published for these trial categories. Now, category 1 trials, as I said before, we have to consider the specific elements for these early development phase trials and consider the difference on the population age. Under the new rules, publication of protocol and summary of results together for clinical trials category 1 conducted in pediatric or part of the pediatric investigational plan. The timing for the publication is expected to be 6 months from the end of the trial in the EUEA. That is when the results are due. So as soon as the summary of results are provided for these trials, within 6 months from the end of the trial, the results will be published together with the protocol. Category 1 trials in adults, the principle is the same, publication of protocol and summary of results simultaneously. The difference is the point in time, because in this case, the results will be submitted in the secure domain after 12 months as per legal requirements, but the publication will occur 18 months later for a total of 30 months after the end of the trial in the European Union. Let me mention also the clinical study reports, the CSR, that are required according to the regulation to be submitted only in case the results of the trial are used in a marketing authorization application. And this can be a national procedure, a mutual recognition, decentralized procedure, or a centralized procedure. In any case, the clinical study reports will have to be submitted within 30 days from the end of the marketing authorization procedure. So while the summary of results are provided by the sponsors for all the trials, the clinical study reports are provided by the marketing authorization applicant or holder, and within 30 days from the end of the procedure. Let's focus now on the expected benefits of this revision for the different stakeholders group, because also, as illustrated by Giacomo, it's clear that different stakeholders have different expectations and different needs. So the benefits for the patients: by removing the deferral functionalities, the patients can access data and document as early as possible during the trial life cycle and prior to the start of the trial. Reduce complexity is beneficial because also to navigate in the public website will be easier and easier to identify the documents that are published, enabling patients to easily have access to the information. And also earlier access to information for patients can translate in earlier start of the trial and enrollment of patients in the trial. Healthcare professionals, the benefits are on the user friendliness, of course, and the accessing the information, and also have increased awareness on possible treatment options. The benefits for sponsors. Of course, we have heard from sponsors with the survey that the current transparency rules are really burdensome. It's really difficult at the moment to provide a version of the documents for publication and not for publication with the tight timelines of the regulation. And we do not want that the transparency requirements represent an obstacle in applying for clinical trials in the European Union. So less document requiring reduction, reduce complexity, and making easier and faster the preparation of the clinical trial application dossier. Removal of the deferral mechanism will also reduce the risk of unintended disclosure of CCI, and having a simpler and earlier publication process, as we have said before, can increase patients' engagement and trust. An overview now of the next steps, and also to give you a flavor of the timelines on how we will progress with these revised rules for CTIS. So the topic is in the agenda of the next management board that will take, EMA management board, that will take place on the 5th of October, where the new rules will be presented. If endorsed, and one endorsed, will then be the phase to move to the changes in the system and work on the implementation and testing of the new functionalities in CTIS, and this is expected for the last quarter of 2023 and the beginning of 2024. And then the final step will be the launch of the revamped public portal expected for next year. Of course, the more precise date, being dependent on the development of the system, will be provided in due course. Let me conclude the presentation with a take-home message on what we have heard about the revision of the rules for CTIS. Publication of clinical trial information is really important, and for different reasons: to enable trust, to identify the right clinical development pathway, to avoid unnecessary duplication of trials, to inform on methods and results, and to ensure that patients have access to clinical trial information of their interest. Key information on trials needs to be fundable and available in a timely manner, and simplified publication rules will reduce the burden for the users and therefore will help to promote the conduct of clinical research in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for articulating so nicely the relevant changes that we are proposing and the benefits that it can bring and how it has taken into account all the views expressed during the consultation. So I think we can now open for comments and open for discussion. And I would like before to introduce the colleagues that will be in the panel and that have agreed to answer any question or any request for clarification. And it's my pleasure to introduce Marianne Lunzer, who comes from the Austrian Agency for Health and Food Safety, and who is the chair of the Heads of Medicines Agency's Clinical Trials Coordination Group, CTCG. We also have with us Peter Arlett, who is the head of Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at the European Medicines Agency, and which is behind all the work on clinical trials in the agency. Also, we have Anne-Sophie Henry-Oud, who is the head of Documents Access and Publication Department at the agency, which is also another element which is supporting transparency in the agency. And this will be together with Maria Mabris, who is the Patient Engagement Liaison, working with interaction with patients and consumers, and who will help us also reading any comments which can come through the chat. So I think it has all been very clear, but comments from participants? Yeah, we have Rita Kessler.
Yes, many thanks. Thank you for the presentation. So just to see if I understood everything well, so the deferral mechanism will disappear. This is what I understood. And only for category 1 products, specific rules for protection remain. And I have another question. Anonymized individual patient data, will they be published with a clinical study report? Because there was nothing on these data. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Laura?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the understanding is correct. So in the proposal, there is the removal of the deferral functionalities. Only for a category 1 trials, we will retain the publication after few months, as you have seen, is the publication of the results in the protocol 30 months after the end of the trial in the EU. And regarding your last point on the protection of personal data for the patients, if I understand correctly, will be applicable because all the documents that will be in the public domain will have to be anonymized. We have recently published a guidance document explaining the principle on protection of personal data and CCI. So this will be, of course, applicable for the documents that will be in the public domain.
Thank you very much. There's one question in the chat who is asking whether the proposed rules are available online. And well, the answer is not yet. They are proposed, but maybe Laura, I think you can remind of the next steps.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. So the proposed rules that you have seen are currently not published. They will be presented, as we said, to the management board. And then after the endorsement, the EMA will publish a document which will replace the appendix on disclosure defining the new rules. So at the moment, you cannot find them in our corporate website.
Just to stress that you are the first stakeholders who are giving this information, and this is, of course, still on the open. Maria, I think we have a question. You want to read it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Juan. So we have a question from François Rier from Eurodis, who asks, can we have an idea on the quantitative impact of the simplification? For example, will the suppression of referrals limit the quantity of documents or of processes, and by what percentage? Thank you.
Who would like to take this one? Peter?
So thanks, Francois, for the question. Peter Arlett here. All clinical trials will be, once approved, will go into the public domain. So in terms of quantity of clinical trials, it's 100%, as with the current rules. In terms of structured data, there's very little change with those minor points of detail that Laura pointed out for category 1, so these very early clinical trials. In terms of documents, the fundamental change, and it is a fundamental change with these new rules, is much, 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 much earlier publication of the key documents, particularly the protocols and the final study reports. And so because we've done it, we are proposing to do away with the deferrals, which had the effect, or have the effect, and have been widely used in the applications we've seen over the first 18 months of the clinical trials regulation. It means that many years earlier, patients, healthcare professionals, and other sponsors will be able to see key documents about the design of the clinical trial and the results from the clinical trial. In terms of the total number of documents, I have to say we haven't done a quantitative analysis, but I think the key point is that key documents, those that will be impactful, for example, for patients wanting to know what clinical trials they might enroll in, they will be published and made available immediately on approval of the clinical trial. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any further question?
There is a follow-up question from Rita about whether the anonymized individual patient data will be made publicly available.
Laura? Rita, can you please clarify a little bit? I don't know, you can take the floor. Yes.
Yes, thank you. So until now, it's difficult for researchers to get access to the anonymized individual patient data, but it's very helpful for the research. So I was wondering if with a new system, if these data will be made available publicly.
Can we give the floor first to Anne-Sophie and then maybe Marianne can complement? Anne-Sophie?
Good afternoon. I do understand that you're speaking about the patient line listing, which are contained in the Annex 16 of a CSR, and please correct me if I'm wrong. It's completely in line also with the phase 2 of clinical data publication. So for the time being in the CTIS, when we speak about CSR, we're not particularly addressing the patient line listing from the Annex 16 is more on the body and specific annexes. And internally, this is something we're discussing together in order to align clinical data publication and CTIS or any other transparency on patient line listing.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie. Marianne?
I think it has all been mentioned now. Nothing to add from my side. Thank you.
Juan, maybe maybe Rita's question is a nice opportunity to just take 2 or 3 steps backwards, because clearly the CTIS transparency rules are critical. They apply to all clinical trials being conducted in the European Union. And then the clinical data publication applies to applications for marketing authorizations in the EU, and it's complementary and additive in terms of transparency. Maybe just one final point to mention, that in the context of the big data roadmap, if you like, that the European Medicines Agency and heads of agencies have adopted, there is currently an ongoing pilot of analysis of raw data, to use Rita's term, from clinical trials, to see whether the assessment during marketing authorization application can be enriched and perhaps improved if we reanalyze raw data submitted. And that pilot is about halfway through its course. I would have thought within 18 months we'll be publishing results from it, and that'll be very interesting. We can share it with you when it's available. Thank you.
Thank you for this. Indeed, I think it's important to clarify that we have to look at it all in a coordinated manner. I think we have another question, Maria.
Yes, thank you, Juan. The question from Christina Manfredi is, can you please confirm which key documents will be published, and will the new rules be applied also to trials already authorized with current deferrals?
Thank you. Laura?
Thank you. So from, as described in the presentation, for categories 2 and 3, the documents that will be published are the protocol, including the synopsis and the patient-facing document, the informed consent template, the recruitment arrangement, including advertising material, and the SMPC in case the medicinal product has a marketing authorization. Then the results when they are submitted. For the category 1, we will publish the protocol and the results, and the publication of these 2 documents will occur together. Your question is also about if these new rules will apply also for the trials that are currently covered by deferrals. So it's true that at the moment we have in the database trials that have been submitted and authorized under the current rules that have deferrals in place and are not in the public domain. For these trials, we are considering options in relation to the publication, also considering the implication by the IT point of view. Of course, we are aiming at simplification, so we will have also to see, and discussions are ongoing internally on how to deal with the publication of those trials.
Can I compliment one? Just a nice segue to just tell those on the webinar that under the clinical trials regulation by the end of August, so a few weeks ago, we had 2,129 applications through the clinical trials regulation through the CTIS system, and also by the end of August, 1,163 clinical trials approved. So the numbers are now at up about the level, perhaps just a fraction under, but about the level we had under the Clinical Trials Directive. And this is really encouraging. Now, what that also means is that when these new rules come in line with what Laura just said, when these new rules come into place, there'll be a legacy of a couple of thousand clinical trials, which we'll have to deal with in terms of the amount of information to put into the public domain.
Thanks for this, because it puts everything into context. And Marianne, please.
Yeah, and plus, I would like to say we have to bear in mind that a huge number of trials will still come into the system before the application of the new rules, with all the transition trials that will have to happen, or with all the trials that need to be transitioned until the end of the transition period. So there will be at least 4,000 to 5,000 trials, of which we will have to care of then later on.
Okay, no, it illustrates very well. Thank you very much. Any further comment? Okay, maybe just to also add that, I mean, we definitely, we will not put on the public domain the text until it is agreed by the management board. But in any case, this webinar will be published, and this will be published together with the slides, and the slides detail all this information. It will take a few days, of course, to reach the webpage, but it will be publicly available, and we will let you know once this is published. Any further comment? Otherwise, we understand everything is clear. I guess everything is welcome. Maybe I would ask Marianne, would you like to add anything from the point of view of how member states welcome or see the new rules and how this is going to impact implementation overall at national level?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to raise a few points from our perspective. It's so important that at least basic information is available for the patient right away, immediately after the authorization of the trial, in order to stimulate patient recruitment. And based on the simplification of rules, we are really hoping to make Europe attractive both for patients and for scientists to perform clinical trials. And it is also important to reassure everyone that there are no data breaches, which was very well mentioned by Giacomo at the beginning in his presentation. Every transparency has to be outweighed by ensuring people that it is not counterbalanced by data breaches of any kind. So I'm very happy that we were able to contribute in this in this exercise, and I think the result is really very nicely balancing the different interests of stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne, for this. And indeed, I think we believe this will make a difference, and that hopefully we can measure the impact that this will have in the coming years. I think before closing, Peter, can I give you a last word?
Yeah, so thanks, Juan, for organising the meeting and chairing the meeting. It's really important to us that key stakeholders are familiarised with the rules before they're published or adopted by the management board and published. Maybe just to reiterate some of the comments that Bjorn Eriksson said at the beginning, clinical trials are at the heart of clinical evidence, and clinical evidence is at the heart of a marketing authorization dossier, as well as how we improve the safety and effectiveness of products on the market. We need collectively, as stakeholders, as regulators, as sponsors, as patients, to do all we can to improve the environment for clinical research in Europe, to get better more impactful clinical trials being done in Europe. And obviously, transparency is an important part of that because it supports patients, it supports trust, it supports enrollment. And the new rules that have been presented by Giacomo and Laura today are trying to achieve that. It's been really fascinating seeing the results coming back from the public consultation, diverse results, but actually there was a clear path through that diversity in terms of what we've summarized for you today, doing away with deferrals and focusing on very rapid publication of key documents and data. So I hope the stakeholders that are on the call today will see that we have found that sweet path or clear path through, and that will improve the operation of the clinical trials regulation, will maintain high levels of transparency, and will support stakeholders in their decision making about clinical trials. So thanks very much.
Thanks to you, Peter and colleagues. Thanks to Bjorn and to Marianne and also Anne-Sophie, Laura and Giacomo and Maria for supporting this and giving this preview of the new rules coming up. As we said, we will now also share with commercial sponsors and industry, and afterwards we will go to the management board, and then we will keep everybody informed. We will disseminate among yourselves the rules when they become public, and of course we will keep patients, healthcare professionals, and academia informed as we implement these rules, and as we hopefully, as we said, we measure a positive impact overall. Thank you very much again, and we will be in touch, as we said. Thank you. Bye.
So Francois has just sent a follow-up question, so we'll take this question before we close. He asks about structured data. Principal investigators' contact details weren't highlighted in green, and yet same results than for information on products. Is there any reason for not selecting this?
Okay, thank you. Yes, we did not flag with color coding each and every field, just the ones, as Giacomo explained, that had an overwhelming, let's say, feedback from during the public consultation on the publication of the contact details. At the moment in CTIS, we have email address and telephone number of the PI published, but with experience, we have seen that in some cases, we do not have a functional contact point. We might have the private contact point of the PI. So as part of the revision, these two fields with the email address and the contact details are not proposed to be any longer in the public domain, but keeping in mind that the scientific contact point and the public contact point from the sponsor side will continue to be published. So this would be the reasoning for not publishing the PI contact details, because in some cases are not functional details. I hope this clarifies.
Thank you. So, okay, so we wait one more minute. If there's no questions, then we can now formally close. Okay, doesn't seem to be the case. So thank you again. And now we formally will close the webinar.